a funny thing happened. I actually changed the title of my presentation because I have some brand new data to drop. And it didn't quite get through, so I'm going to actually have to give you the new title. New delicious data on weight gain, Skittles, and cholesterol. Yes, even cholesterol. So I also have some pictures that I've never shown before. This was me at my fighting weight, I guess you could say, in 2009, maybe 2010, when I was running for the first time with my wife. As you can see, I was a little bit puffier, but that was actually my best weight at the time. And pretty much throughout the years, this is still long ago, this is back when I was first meeting my wife, you can actually see a lot of the weight that was on my body without even looking at my gut. This was actually our engagement photo. In 2011, I was 209 pounds. But once I'd gone fully keto, lost 25 pounds. This isn't even what I'm back to yet. Because in my process of wanting to get obsessed with cholesterol and all the self-experimenting I've been doing, I went ahead and did something that I never ever thought that I would do. And I'm kind of still in the process of getting done with it. It's the weight gain experiment. Notice the byline, not a typo. So let me kind of take you through it. This is what happened. Basically, I had what I would call an opportunity scenario. So many of you know that I do a lot of N of 1 experiments, and one of the ones that I'll be going through is actually the capstone experiment and the added sugar experiment, which has to do with the Skittles. And so with that, I ended up actually gaining a little bit of weight. And my anniversary trip with my wife, for our 10-year anniversary, which was just this last April, I said, you know what? I could actually make another experiment out of this. So honey, try to imagine this. I'm walking in the bedroom. It's a very memorable moment. Said, honey, it would really help my research a lot if I could gain about 20 to 25 pounds of fat. That's how wonderful my wife is, that she green-lighted it. So yes, with the upcoming trip and a very understanding wife, I decided that for 4 weeks, I would be on what would be basically standard American diet. I would leave keto to then go ahead and do this. Now, the obvious upsides are chance to observe and compare the cholesterol data, particularly at a higher weight, going from the standard American diet to a ketogenic diet. Now, there are downsides, and I want to emphasize this because while I'm going to be somewhat lighthearted throughout all of this, I really want to emphasize there are short and long-term risks with doing this. Let's put it very plainly. In order for me to gain weight quickly, I have to induce a state of hyperinsulinemia. That is how you gain weight, high levels of insulin. And that does carry risks. So throughout all of this time, and including in this presentation, I've been telling people, go ahead and be inspired by a lot of the experiments I do. Don't be inspired by this one. Don't do this experiment. But that said, boy, do I have some exciting data that came out of it. Okay. This, by the way, is different shots of media during those periods of time where I had been in the process of gaining weight and losing weight. So you can already see some of the differences in comparison to the photo you saw earlier. And this is the timeline that I had. Now, as you can see in that kind of purple area to the far left, that was sort of the run-up to when I was going to get the beginning of the standard American diet, and then I ramped up hard during the peak period. And you see I'm taking tests throughout. I'm taking a DEXA scan, which is a full-body scan, very low-dose radiation, but you actually capture muscle mass and fat mass and so forth. And I was also getting blood tests and even wide-spectrum tests at certain points throughout this process. What was my uncontrolled standard American diet? Well, uncontrolled means it was unplanned, but with the intent to be in a standard American diet. Much of this took place over the anniversary trip that I did, but also before that. And yes, as you can see, I had a lot of bread, I had a lot of cheese, I had a lot of meat. Basically, having both carbs and fat can certainly get you to a high state of hyperinsulinemia and a lot of stored fat. Now, unfortunately, May 2nd was when I returned and I weighed myself and I hadn't yet reached enough body fat when I was trying to shoot for 20 to 25 pounds. At 202, I wasn't quite there yet. I was trying to get to 205. So, fortunately, I was now entering the controlled standard American diet. And this is the controlled standard American diet. Now I'm eating to a schedule and the exact same things every single day. Started off at 10 a.m. with a foot-long Subway sandwich. It's okay, though, because it was whole wheat bread. With my supplements, and then on top of that, I had at 3 p.m. a medium pizza. And then I finished it off at 8 p.m. with a Subway sandwich. Anyone want to guess if this helped me to gain weight? Yeah. Actually, let me go back to that real quick. Yeah, so total calories, 4212, 4217. Never mind that. Look at the fat, 177 grams, and carbs at 356. Sure enough, almost got there at 204.2. Still about 0.8 pounds short. But per the plan, after 5 of these days, I then went ahead and did the switch. And what did I get at the switch? All of this. I took enormous amounts of tests at the point at which I was switching from a standard American diet to a ketogenic diet because up to this point, to the best of my knowledge, nobody had ever done this. And I wanted to actually capture as fixed a data as I could with the only major variable changing is going from a standard American diet that was known and fixed to a ketogenic diet that was also known and fixed with, by the way, the same supplements throughout. And incidentally, I was having the same amount of exercise each day, about 2.5 miles of walking. So I tried to keep everything, even the sleep cycles, about as the same as possible so that we could observe what variables changed as my weight changed. So here were the blood tests I took, 21 in total. Some of these that unpack like the CIMT out to like 14 different tests. I have more data now than I can actually analyze, and I'm going to be open sourcing all of this here pretty soon once I have it all collected. And now we begin the ketogenic phase. And what do I have for the ketogenic phase? Well, actually, I eat to the same timeline. I eat to 10 a.m., 3 p.m., and 8 p.m. with an almond snack in the middle. And here's what the macros look like for that. The fat is actually less. It's a little bit more. It's at 205 grams. What's less is the protein at 128 grams and the carbs at 20 grams. 3% of my diet now is carbs. So this is what my macros look like. It's almost this perfect plateau of going from SAD to then over to keto. And yes, think about it. I'm eating the same every single day. So it's like Groundhog Day, pretty much. By the way, I was telling somebody else about this, I think one of my nieces, and she was like, Groundhog Day? What is that about? That's how old I'm getting, I guess. So what happened to my RER, also typically known as RQ, my respiratory quotient? Well, sure enough, we see at the ramp up, I'm burning mostly sugar. And then eventually at the peak, and remember this date, remember May 7th, that's the switch off point. At the peak, I'm burning 81% sugar, 19% fat. And then I'm getting another test 7 days later, and voila, I'm now burning 30% sugar, 70% fat. My RER is now to 0.79. 4 days later, it's to 0.75. Okay, so now let's look at triglycerides versus weight. I was very interested in this because those of you who follow me know just how much I care about triglycerides in the blood and what it's saying about health. Well, this doesn't really help us a lot when we're doing an absolute comparison between my weight and my triglycerides. So let's make it a relative comparison. Again, this is in the fixed period. The first 5 days being when I was in the standard American diet of the ones you saw at 3 p.m., at 10 a.m., 3 p.m., and 8 p.m., and then switching over to keto for almost all the rest of the graph. This was the 2 peaks and valleys of the weight, 204.5 to 199. And this is what it is in a relative comparison. So you can see the trigs closely follow. Pearson of a 0.85 closely follow, going down as my weight dropped by a very marginal amount. But now the kicker. How interested are we in the thing that's constantly talked about in LDL-C, LDL cholesterol, the bad cholesterol? Does that go up with weight gain? Well, anecdotally, we talk about it a lot. Wouldn't it be great if somebody just obsessively decided to just do all of this in order to find out on that one variable change what would happen? This is what happened. Remember, this is a delta of about 5 pounds. LDL at 133 at the bottom when I weighed more. What happens in the short span of time when I change the 5 pounds of difference? 228 milligrams per deciliter. My LDL cholesterol increased by 100 milligrams per deciliter. And again, you know now, without much of any other changes other than moving over to a ketogenic diet and losing weight. This is, by the way, what happens when we go ahead and invert it. Pearson's astonishing. It's a inverse 0.936. It's just fantastic. This, by the way, is if you want to plot it, look at the regression. The regression is 0.8481. Amazing. Now, here's where it gets a lot of fun. A lot of you guys just saw Megan, right? Megan Ramos was talking about fasting, and this comes up a lot with whether or not if you go on a fast, or for that matter, if you're starting to lose weight on a ketogenic diet, if you're going to lose lean mass. Well, I'm sorry to say that yes, going from 5'7" to 5'18", my total mass dropped was 3.9 pounds, and these are DEXA scans. And I lost 3.8 pounds of lean mass and just 0.1 pounds of fat mass. But that's not the whole story. See, those were those scans over there. What about these two scans when I started? Well, I happened to get 2 scans 3 days apart, right at the beginning of the ramp up of where I was starting to do the standard American diet. And this is what they look like. As you can see, at the beginning of the weekend, on Friday morning at 4:13, I had a total mass of 194.7. Then I ramp up all of the carbs and the fat, and my lean mass goes from 132 to 3 days later, 136.3. I gained 4.3 pounds of muscle. No, I didn't gain 4.3 pounds of muscle. Again, I've been doing 2.5 miles of walking each day. So it's not like I suddenly hit the gym and suddenly pumped up. No, what's fascinating is almost all of that gain, and it really threw off the DEXA scan coordinator, almost all of that gain was in my legs. Both of my legs. So no, I gained a lot of glycogen and water. So now when we look at this whole thing together, did I really gain 4 pounds of muscle and then lose the same 4 pounds of muscle after I switched back to a ketogenic diet? I'm not convinced at all. No, I think I gained and lost glycogen and water. And that's something that I would now expect, and certainly something that I would want all of you to know if you're actually doing DEXA scans right as you're switching over. This is why it's so fantastic to try to get even really obsessive amounts of N1 data where you at least wreck your life to try to get everything else constant so you can see the one thing that changes. And in the case of this, I'm really glad I got the DEXA scans from 413 to 416, or I would have had the same misunderstanding that I think a lot of other people would. All right, let's talk about added sugar. So now we're going to go back in time a little bit, and I'm going to talk about what was originally going to be cookies, but I found out they had had too much fat, so I needed something that was just almost entirely sugar, and I had that in Skittles. So this was going back to February 1st. I had an intervention phase in which I was going to, for stage 3, have Skittles to the same fatty meal set that you saw from before, where it was mainly eggs and cheese. But then in the middle of the experiment, and you can see this in my blog, I realized something. Unfortunately, I kind of made a mistake. See, every time I had done an experiment that involved bringing back in carbs, I usually had the carbs either before or during the meal. And I naturally couldn't help it. When I had a fatty meal and I was having Skittles, I'd think of the Skittles as like dessert. And I would have it afterwards. So then I went, that could have been a confounder. Would I be really willing to extend this experiment a whole lot more to find out another intervention phase? Well, you guys already know the answer to that. Of course I would, yes. So I had an aftermath period and an additional washout period where I went back to the exact same baseline diet, and now I did it a little bit differently. This time I had the Skittles before the meal. And then finally one more aftermath period after that. So basically, we're now seeing all of the fat, carbs, and protein for all the times that I had, except the difference between these two intervention phases is that one is where I have the Skittles second, and one is where I have it first. Pretty straightforward. So what happened? Well, actually, the glucose versus ketones is kind of interesting, but for the most part, my glucose remained relatively stable, which somewhat surprised me, but somewhat didn't because I still maintain a lot of flexibility. What was fascinating was that I saw ketones drop a little bit more pronounced after the period in which I was doing more of the Skittles loading. Thought that was kind of fascinating. But this is one of the more interesting things that I've ever come up with in all of my data. Now we're going to actually watch what happens to both my glucose and insulin. So this is the first blood test I got, baseline blood test. I hadn't introduced any Skittles yet. And as you can see, my serum glucose is 98. And my insulin is 3, super low. And by the way, this is typical for lean mass hyperresponders. They'll tend to have fire-fasting glucose, but have super low insulin, showing a lot of adaptive glucose sparing. Well, I go ahead and get a test after the very first day I introduced the Skittles. And again, these are the Skittles after the meal. And voila, my glucose, my fasting glucose, sure enough, jumps up to 112. But fortunately, my fasting insulin was still at 4. Well, now we go ahead and go through the whole weekend, and voila, we now see that it's pretty close to the same, but now the fasting insulin has gone up to 6. So after the first intervention phase of where I was having the Skittles after the meal, we see the fasting glucose at the very end ends up being 6. Well, now I go ahead and go through the washout period. I unfortunately wasn't able to get another baseline test because there was a problem with the lab, but I was able to get, of course, the money shot, the final test, after I had done a weekend of where I did the Skittles before the meal. And what do you think? You guys think the insulin was higher or lower? Or do you think it was the same? Anyone? Yes. The highest, at that point, the highest insulin score I'd ever had. My fasting glucose was 120. My fasting insulin was 11. I was dumbfounded that it made that much of a difference. So there might actually be some biological signaling as to why it is we'd want to have sweets following a meal instead of before. But that for sure is definitely, if not that I cheat, but if I were to cheat, I would try to shoot for having it as far away from the fatty meal as I could, and definitely not before it. All right. Now this is a section I've been looking forward to showing you guys for a while. Some of you already know some of this, some of you don't. But you may want to become familiar with something known as the carotid arteries of your necks. Many of you guys already are, but basically there's a test, a CIMT, a carotid intima media thickness test, that basically can capture the thickness that's found on both sides. And this is kind of basically a diagram. For the most part, it's looking at the common carotid artery. Again, you have one on each side of your neck. This is sort of what it looks like. It's an ultrasound, and so they gel up the sensor and they get it onto each side of the neck, and this is kind of a picture of what it looks like. This is also what they're looking to measure. Now, this is commonly associated with atherosclerosis. You'll see a lot of studies that use that as a proxy. And this is what's been happening to my left carotid artery while I've been on a ketogenic diet, coming all the way up to November of 2017 of last year. All the way up to this point, it's gone down on the left side. The right side has even been more dramatic. It started at a much higher level. I've dropped about 150 nanometers, going all the way down again to 11,117. Okay, well this was all following a ketogenic diet except for those times in which I was doing like carb swap experiments, but those were much more limited. Well, now let's look at what happened when I did my most recent carotid artery test following the standard American diet. This was a few days after I had completed it. This is what happened to the right carotid artery. And let me go ahead and get to the hard numbers. This is the table. So yes, where my left carotid artery started out at 558, it jumped up to 610. Where my right had started at 687 and had regressed to almost perfectly match the other side. It had jumped up to 694. This is the lowest ever on both sides that I had from the last test before this, and then to the highest ever on both sides in the last test. So I'm going to give you a little bit of comparison as to what really changed. Unfortunately, I forgot the attribution, but you can actually look this up online. If you go ahead and do searches on CIMT tests and different ranges, these are all the ones that applied, and I converted the units here. So you can see where I was in November 17. In this one, for example, I was well below the median, and now I'm above the 75th percentile. In this one, same thing, except I'm even under the 20th percentile here, jumping up to the 80th percentile. And then yes, from between 25th and 50th percentile here, and above the 95th percentile for this last study. So without question, I moved from very low risk to very high risk. Now, the next slide I'm going to show you may be the most meaningful slide I put into any presentation. Are you ready? Have I built it up enough? Okay. This is the text from one of the articles that actually talks about this. Aging is a contributing factor to increased carotid intima media thickness. Other risk factors include high lipoprotein levels. High lipoprotein levels. That's a high risk for the increase specifically of your carotid arteries, right? Well, I want you to take a look at this table again, but now I'm going to extend out LDL-C and LDL-P. What was happening while I was on a ketogenic diet? Well, I'm not like anybody else in this room, I literally just hit my anniversary of 100 blood tests this last Tuesday. 100 blood draws since November 2015. So I have a barometer unlike anybody else. I know what my lipids are, almost like a stock ticker, right? And I've been averaging above 200 LDL-C and above 2,000 LDL-P, absent a few times where I've done experiments to intentionally manipulate them. And while that's been happening, my left and right carotid arteries thickness has been regressing. So what happened when I was on the 4-week standard American diet? Well, as I predicted, my LDL-C went back to what it was before I started a ketogenic diet, back to the 130s. So here I am, I'm operating on 130 LDL-C and an LDL-P of 1,130, well below what I was operating at before. And what happened to the thickness of my carotid arteries? So given this alone, what do you think I would prescribe myself to go back? You better believe I'm going back on a ketogenic diet. I'm going to be eating a lot of saturated fat. That's all I can say. We got to revisit this. 1 year ago, KetoFest cholesterol experiment. So what happened? Well, you guys all know the inversion pattern, right? Inversion pattern, not the one I just showed you. But this other one where, sure enough, you eat a lot of fat, you'll see lower LDL-C. We tested that by having a bunch of the people going ahead and following this protocol. And this was, again, exactly last year. Well, actually, not exactly last year, but this year and a few weeks more. From July 11th to July 13th, the participants were instructed to either eat low-calorie, ketogenic, or to fast altogether. And then went ahead and did a 12 to 14-hour water fast. And then, of course, on the morning of Friday, July 14th, everybody took a blood test, the first blood test, the first data point you're going to see. Then everybody was instructed to gorge during KetoFest. Have you guys been doing that experiment right now, by the way? Okay. We should have just taken blood tests. That would have been a little bit easier. And then take a second blood test for the Monday. And I posted the hypothesis for this in advance. We'll see how that hypothesis worked out. But I predicted the majority of them would, sure enough, see their LDL-C drop. Thanks to the folks at PTS Diagnostics, they basically covered this experiment, at least the cost for all the equipment and testing. I don't know if you know this guy, but he got to participate as well. And I don't know if you know these people, but there are also some fine speakers that I'm looking forward to seeing today. And then, this table shows everything that's in blue. That's everybody who saw a decline in their LDL-C in 3 days. Only 3 people saw an increase. So a mean across the board was 25.7 drop in LDL-C. And this is what it looks like if you plot it in what I like to call the broken ladder. Basically, no matter where you started on here, even Kim Howerton, who, by the way, held our lowest LDL cholesterol, she even dropped. She's down there at the purple, down at the bottom. It didn't matter where you started on here. 19 of the 22 saw a decrease of between 5 and 38% of their LDL-C. And only 3 had an increase, and it was only of 1 to 2%. And I've got a little bit of breaking news. I am happy to say the first paper for the lipid energy model is in development. Thank you. It will be focusing on my first phase of my data, the inversion pattern, and it will feature the 10-day Feldman protocol performed by Craig Moffitt. Craig Moffitt, wave over there. Thank you, Craig. And Silvio Ferrer, who I suspect may be watching right now, and if so, hi, Silvio. How are you? It's being prepared by the magnificent Tommy Wood. If you haven't heard of him before, look him up. He's fantastic, great researcher, and he's helping me get through all of the bureaucracy that us engineers don't have as much interest in. So thank you so much, Tommy. I really appreciate it. If you want to actually see what it looks like, we're going to show you a little bit of previewing here. Probably not supposed to, but this actually is Silvio's chart. This one is mine. Of course, I've got a lot more data points than they do. Craig got to start way higher than the rest of us because he's a lean mass hyperresponder. But you notice no matter, again, where you started, if you were doing the protocol, you were heading down, showing just how dynamic the lipid system is. This, I'm not going to read all the way through, but basically it further emphasizes just how much fat and protein, but not so much carbs, are having such a big impact. And that was before we even counterbalanced it with some of the other data I've done with the carb swapping experiments. Now, I finally want to kind of leave you one more time with the lipid energy model, because while I've never done this in a presentation before, I'm actually going to pitch the presentation following this one. Siobhan Huggins is going to make her very first presentation here today, and she's going to cover the other aspect. Thank you. She's going to cover the other aspect of lipids. But I want to lead off by refreshing on the lipid energy model as to what that side of the ledger is for me, and the one that I focus on a lot. Listen, you're hearing all day long about carbs and protein and fat. And you can be forgiven if you've heard constantly how all your fat converts into ketones and now you're powered by ketones. That's technically mostly false. It's somewhat true in that, particularly for your brain, you need the ketones. You do get a lot of energy from ketones to your tissues. But the truth is, the majority of the fatty acids that are supplied to your cells are supplied as fatty acids, not as ketones. Or to put it another way, most of the fatty acids that will power your cells weren't broken down into ketones in the first place. Or I should say, weren't broken down to ketones in the liver. Some biochem geeks out there are going to point out that the third step inside of the mitochondria will make a difference. So anyway, sorry. Cytoplasm. See? You guys are already tripping me up and you're not even in the room. So yes, there's a whole other world of direct fatty acid delivery to your cells, and that's super relevant to how it is that you're powered on a low-carb, high-fat diet. In fact, I like to joke that I'm not really on a ketogenic diet, I'm on a fatty acid diet. But that's not as sexy, right? It's not saying, oh, I'm on a fatty acid diet. Keto sounds so much cooler. But sure enough, I want to focus the most on triglycerides, because triglycerides are what gets carried in lipoproteins, and in particular in chylomicrons and VLDLs for delivery. So let's go ahead and break it down a little bit more. These are chylomicrons. Chylomicrons eventually become chylomicron remnants after they drop off all of their energy. The little boxes with the lightning bolts are how I'm associating the energy you get from triglycerides. And sure enough, once they're done, they go to the liver. Well, where do chylomicrons come from? They come from your intestinal tract because they came from food you probably just ate. Probably just had a lot of fat, which has now been packaged up. It's now been sent on its way. And here's the catch. The catch is chylomicrons go away really quickly. Chylomicrons, that's why I like to call them the sprinters. They run out real quick. They drop off their energy. They disappear. And therefore, even the little bit of cholesterol that's on chylomicrons pretty much never shows up in a blood test unless you took a blood test shortly after you ate a meal, which you shouldn't do, by the way. Just an aside. Well, they're counterbalanced. That's the whole basis of the inversion pattern. They're counterbalanced with VLDLs, very low density lipoproteins that primarily come from the liver and primarily from stored fat, fat that was stored in your adipocytes, or for that matter, that was even on board in the liver itself. And as they drop off energy, they too remodel to IDL and eventually get cleared by the liver, but that's not the whole story. You see, while this is the story of energy delivery, there's another half of the story which is about support. You hear about HDL cholesterol, and that's on board the lipoproteins that are HDL. But there's also this other one that they work with a lot. The one you hear about is called bad cholesterol, LDL. But it also plays a role in support. So putting it all together, we're talking about energy delivery, support. Energy delivery, support. There's just one lipoprotein that's pulling double duty. And I swear, this is the key to so many things for your being able to understand cholesterol. When you know that there's one lipoprotein that does so much work, both in delivering energy and in a role of support, you start to really understand it. And while I tend to focus a little bit more on the left side of the dotted line, Siobhan Huggins tends to put a little bit more effort on the right side of the dotted line. So, now let's go ahead and put this all together because this becomes super relevant to you if you are powered by fat. What happens with these simple molecules when they take these routes? What remains? Well, pretty much nothing. I mean, yes, there are byproducts that come off, but not the thing that carried it there. And same thing for the lower ends of how you get fatty acid delivery, particularly when it's coming from fat, particularly when it's bound to, like, say, albumin. Virtually nothing remains. But, on the contrary, if you have VLDL supply of a lot of fatty acids in your bloodstream, you are going to see a remaining LDL particle. And that's how I'm able to bring LDL cholesterol up and down, is because I'm bringing up and down the total amount of LDL particles in your blood. So if I'm eating a lot of fat, I'm bringing in a lot of chylomicrons, there needs to be less counterbalancing VLDLs. And if there's less counterbalancing VLDLs, there's less succeeding LDLs that they were modeled to on the other side of that dotted line, therefore less LDL cholesterol. It's as simple as that. That's how dynamic it is. And we've shown this over and over again now, not just with 100 of my tests, but now with over 100 of the followers of cholesterolcode.com that have actually done the protocol. So now you may ask, well, aren't high VLDLs and triglycerides associated with disease? Well, yes, if they're found lingering in the bloodstream. You see, actually, it isn't the VLDL and triglyceride use that is the problem. It is their lack of use. And remember, this is in the context of energy delivery. Remember, I'm on the other side right now. If you have a lack of energy delivery, well then, this inability to park the triglycerides necessarily means there's going to be more VLDLs resident in the bloodstream. That's why when you learn more about personal fat threshold, it makes perfect sense that you see a higher level of triglycerides and VLDLs resident all the time. That's a problem that you need to be looking at. It's a reason why I care a lot about when people see high triglycerides in their bloodstream. It's something I want to tackle. So here's kind of a quick illustration. This would be high healthy lipid energy trafficking. You've got high VLDL secretion, trafficking, and use, leaving little VLDLs and more of their successor LDLs. So this is what I would expect to see. I would expect to see a very small amount of VLDLs. And hey, I don't know how many LDLs there are, but if there's not a lot of VLDLs, there's not a lot of triglycerides. But let's go the other direction. Let's say that you have bloated up, you notice these are like adipose sites for those people who knows. They're bloated up, they're packed with triglycerides, there's hardly any room to park. Well, now, you don't have a lot of capability for the VLDLs to drop off their energy. There's a lack of use. And therefore, you start having buildup of things like ectopic fat, because you're trying to find anywhere you can park it other than the bloodstream. Body's pretty keen about keeping that highway as clear as possible. So finally, this to kind of wrap it up together, particularly with the energy delivery, for this last slide, I really want you guys to put on your engineering hats with me. Are you ready? Okay. What's the key similarity between an adipose site and a very low density lipoprotein? Each is primarily staging triglycerides as fat-based energy to make available to cells. Okay, so what's the key difference? One's stationary. One's mobile. So in effect, I can say VLDL is effectively an adipocyte on the go. And once you get that, it all can tie together as to why lean mass hyperresponders really do technically have a lot of adipocytes. It's just they're more on the go. And they're very effectively dropping off those triglycerides. I just want to do one more thank you to all the patrons. Some of you are in the room right now. If you could give a round of applause to them. This science would not be possible without them. And that's my talk, guys. Thank you so much for joining me.